dot, that is Finland. So this is the size is small, but Finland and Finnish shipbuilding industry is still very competitive. But anyway, was three major producers, and also like on medium size or small size in Finland. This is Group A, very competitive in terms of both revealed competitiveness and also potential competitiveness. And Group B is medium RCA and medium PCA, and here and again two groups. Some like developing countries are located lower, but USA and Netherlands and France and these are pretty good. But again, the policy implication is, they can invest in these countries and then they can enhance the level of their PCA to make it more competitive. It's a collaboration between Group A countries and also Group B countries. Group C countries are mostly European countries. They are very low in terms of their export performance. Export minus import is very much low, but still they have good potentials. These are European countries, they have strong background of the shipbuilding industry. So they are very competitive, and Norway has the highest PCA among this European and Australia. So this is shipbuilding. Next is iron and steel. The style is a little different, and Group A, Japan and China. Japan is number one, and China is following and catching up Japan. And then Group C, there's only one country, that is USA, and most of the countries are located around the middle. And this shows a very interesting kind of conclusion. This is to say, look at this, if RCA means export minus import, and zero means almost equilibrium. So overall, more or less, their export performance is kind of around like equilibrium, but the vertical axis is very diverse. The potential competitive advantage is very diverse. It's from like high PCA to low PCA. This is to say, kind of one possible implication is, iron and steel industry is very strategically important industry, and most of the countries would like to defend their own industries, or they would like to be self-sufficient in these very important industries. They don't want to depend too much on export and import of these kind of things. So it's pretty much around the equilibrium of export and import, whatever, or regardless of the levels of potential competitiveness. So I would say some kind of strategic issue can be found in this iron and steel industry. But we need more case studies and more rigorous analysis. But even in this kind of like a kind of quick research, we can find some interesting implications for this research. The final one is chemicals. There is one outlier, that is Ireland. It's performing far better than the other countries. I think this is probably because of the multinational firms invested in Ireland, okay, regardless of their core competence. So the performance is good, but the actual potential is not as good as its actual performance. So a lot of foreign direct investment in Ireland, and that might be the reason, FDI issue. But the other countries like Group B, the US and UK, better than or more competitive than the other countries. And Group C and Poland, Italy, and then Spain. So these are Group C, kind of lower level of their performance in the real market. So A, B, C, however, if you look at the diagram very closely, and if you just make a line for the Group B and Group C, and there is a regression line, and we calculate the correlation, the regression coefficient, and this is very much significant. The p-value this is significant and less than 1% statistical issue. This is there's a kind of very straight line or a significant correlation between these two things. This is to say, not very much trade policy in these chemicals. So chemicals industry is more market friendly or market kind of market, how can I say, accommodating kind of industry compared to steel and automobile, and shipbuilding is not that bad actually. So we can find some differences in industry strategies and industry characteristics. Now, this is actually the final part. So we try to link the relationship between the actual performance in the marketplace on the horizontal axis and on the vertical axis, their potential or fundamental competitiveness. But while we were doing this research, we have found kind of interesting possible topic for the issue of strategic trade policy. So this is say some countries in some industries may have stronger strategic trade policies. So what is the characteristic of the industry that leads the home country's kind of strategic trade policy? So we did one more research what causes a strategic trade policy? So number one is, in order to statistically prove, we have to operationalize, we have to quantify. Strategic trade policy is kind of like the abstract or a qualitative variable. So we need to operationalize the variable. So I calculated like this. Strategic trade policy, number one is we need like RCA, the same RCA, that is a revealed advantage, export minus import, divided by the trade amount. PCA is the competitive variable that we are doing, or we have done in this research. And then their units are different. So we have to standardize the units. So we just did this kind of calculation. We divide that by the standard deviation. So the unit is one standard deviation. So now we normalized, we standardized all the units. And now the operationalization of strategic trade policy can be done like this. So we defined strategic trade policy is RCA minus PCA. This is RCA is export performance compared to import. And PCA is actual or real or potential competitiveness. So strategic trade policy is to promote trade more than its capabilities. Okay? It's more than its actual abilities. So strategic trade policy can be defined as to increase RCA compared to its own potential competitiveness. So that is operationalization of strategic trade policy. And then we hypothesize that if the industry is more important, the government of the country is more likely to push or to more stronger, like a strategic trade policy. So the other variable is to measure the industry importance. And I measure that by domestic market share, domestic export share of the industry in the country's total exports. If an industry like iron and steel is like a significant portion, then the country has to push it more export, because domestic market is too small. So the hypothesis is the higher the export share, the more important the strategic industry in the country, thus the higher possibility of the government to support. This is what we call the strategic trade policy in the industry. So we can hypothesize like this. The vertical axis is RCA minus PCA. That is more performance than potential. So this is strategic. This is the proxy variable for strategic trade policy. And the horizontal axis is DES. This is domestic export share. This is the relative importance of the industry. So we could hypothesize the more important, more strategic trade policy. And then we did, and we hypothesized that the regression line should have positive sign, and yes, it turned out to be positive. So automobile is positive, and shipbuilding and positive is very highly significant statistically. It's positive, but chemicals, no positive, no relationship. So in chemicals, relatively no policy. It's just because this is market-friendly or market-accommodating industry, so the government does not have to be much involved in that. Well, we need to do more case studies. But relatively speaking, and shipbuilding and automobile and iron and steel have a more positive relationship between the industry importance and also the strategic trade policy. So number one finding is there's a positive line for these three industries. And number two is very interesting. Number two is Korea is outlier for each of these three industries. Korea is not on the line, or not close to the line, but it's far above, far below, and far to the right. So very interesting is Korea is located like outliers for each of these. This is Korea has not followed the normal pattern of the industry growth of other countries, and that's the reason why Korea has been more successful than the other countries. So don't follow the existing rules. You need like a new paradigms. And shipbuilding is fine, because the RCA minus PCA, the revealed and potential is almost zero, is actually minus 0.025. So it's pretty much market-friendly competitiveness. They didn't have any help from the government. They just did it by themselves. It's a good job for them. But automobile and steel, automobile is so I'm going to finish in a few minutes. The automobile has more performance, higher performance. RCA is higher than PCA, than the normal line. This is to say, Korean automobile industry has done really extraordinary job than its competitors. So this is to say, there might be some kind of trade policies for automobiles, export promotion or import restriction. I don't know the exact kind of policy regulations, but this is kind of size compared to other industries. In other countries, and Korea is more like a market kind of things. and more trade promotion. And actually, I have some other data. Korea's export and domestic ratio is actually 2-to-1, but Japan's export-domestic ratio is just 1-to-1. So Korea is more export-oriented strategy in the automobile. On the other hand, steel industry is just the opposite, more import than export. This is probably because even if there is a strategic trade policy, but Korea needs a lot of steel and iron to support automobile industry and then shipbuilding, because this is raw materials for this very good performing industries. So because of the domestic demand, iron and steel industry has the negative or far below than the normal line. So we have some interesting cases. And this is actually the summary of the things. And the final thing is some strategic implication of the automobile industry is particularly important. It has a better trade performance than its potential. So it needs to enhance the potential competitiveness. But this is to say, RCA is greater than PCA, so you have two choices to get back to the normal. Number one is to reduce RCA, and we don't like it. So they have to continue to increase export. So the other strategy is to enhance potential. So the Korean automobile has to enhance the competitive variables that we have studied to actually enhance the PCA to match it and RCA. So otherwise, if there's any FTA, free trade agreement, or some other freer, market-friendly international kind of consensus, then Korean automobile industry might be in trouble. So this is a really good time to reevaluate the strengths and weaknesses of its industry, then competitiveness for future further takeoff. Now, conclusions and major implications and some implications or findings that we have found from this industry study. And we have studied 4 industries with a special focus on the Korean case. And again, not because this is Korea, but Korea has a lot of interesting cases. And the most important part is the Korean successful cases cannot be explained by existing theories, such as comparative advantage theory. Because at the beginning of my presentation, I said Korea did not have anything that the existing theories that is important, a kind of new kind of advantage. So we need a more comprehensive analytical tool rather than the conventional comparative advantage theory, and we need more variables for explanation. So in this study, we collected 32 different criteria to measure the competitiveness of industry, and those measurements might be better indicators to measure the real competitiveness of those industries rather than typical economic theories of competitive advantages. But anyway, we developed 2 things here for measurement, RC and PCA, and by comparing and by manipulating some of the indices of these 2 variables, we can find many important implications. And this is pretty much theoretical, but also very practical, so we can derive very important implications from this research. So we hope, IPS hope, that this research will benefit practitioners as well as policymakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moon.
그러면 10분간 잠시 휴식 시간 갖도록 하겠습니다. 휴식 시간이 그렇게 길지 않은 건 아니지만요. 밖에 간단한 음료수와 다과가 마련되어 있으니까 10분간 쉬시다가 다시 들어오시면 될 것 같습니다. So ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a 10-minute break. So it's not long, but we have some refreshments and drinks outside of this hall. So please enjoy this small break, and I will see you in 10 minutes. Thank you. 네, 그러면 첫 번째 세션 속개에서 다시 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 저장님 부탁드립니다.
Okay, did you have a nice break? 10 minutes break is too short, right? Okay, now we'll resume the session. We have 2 more papers to go. Just be patient. Simply we have 2 more. Okay, the next speaker is Professor Boon Siong from Singapore. He's going to talk about developing Singapore's national competitiveness. I'm going to just briefly introduce you Dr. Boon Siong. Professor Siong is the director of the Asia Competitiveness Institute in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in the National University of Singapore and a fellow of the Civil Service College. He was formerly the dean of the Nanyang Business School, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Professor Neil is a certified public accountant and holds a Bachelor of Accountancy from the National University of Singapore, and MBA and PhD degrees from the University of Pittsburgh, United States. Professor Neil is a leading expert in business strategy, process management, and organizational change. He has advised many major corporations, facilitated strategy workshops, and led management development programs for global enterprises. He has been described by the media as an expert in advising on change and creative destruction. He has served on many government committees, reviewing policies and recommending changes relating to economic development, education, human capital, international trade, and technology development. I'll just pass the mic to Dr. Neil Siong. Okay, would you start, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What I'd like to do is to share with you some thoughts on how Singapore has developed its national competitiveness over the years. This is just a list of some of the global rankings that Singapore has achieved, including being ranked as among the most competitive nation in the world. What happened? Okay. I leave it up, I put the rankings up there, really just to put it on record. We don't really pay too much attention to the rankings. Rankings are nice if you're ranked among the better ones and you can use it for your marketing and your public relations. But ultimately, it's not about how you're ranked, which is really a snapshot of the past, but what you're doing currently and going forward to continue to improve. So we look at the rankings for a while and then we leave it aside. That's not the real thing that matters to us. Just a snapshot of where Singapore stands. 5 million population, 3.8 million residents, so we have about almost 1 in 4 foreigners, 2.9 million of people in the labor force. The current unemployment rate is 2.2%, which is basically full employment. Our GDP per capita is about 51,000 Singapore dollars, close about 40,000 US dollars per year per person. Last year was a recession year for Singapore, so the economy contracted 1.3%. But this year, in the first quarter, the economy grew 15.5%. In a sense, it demonstrated Singapore's open economy. When the recession hit in 2008, Singapore was the first country in Asia to go into a recession. When the global economy recovered in 2009, Singapore was the first country in Asia to recover. Our trade is 3 times our GDP. So Singapore is very dependent on global trade for its success. The exchange rate right now is about 1 to 1.4. Inflation is currently running at about 3.2%. The labor productivity last year was minus 4.7. So we have a strategic competitive issue there. That while our labor productivity are now at the level of the OECD countries, we can no longer do the same things the same way if we want to continue to improve. We need to look for new ways in order to advance further. If you look at the dimensions of competitiveness, following the Professor Michael Porter's framework, we can look at it from a country's endowment, the macroeconomic competitiveness, and then the microeconomic competitiveness. And these are the various things that we look at. Let me go through very quickly to give you a snapshot of where Singapore stands in these dimensions. I'm not giving you a lot of charts. If you go to our website, the Asia Competitiveness Institute website, we have a detailed report on Singapore's competitiveness with standard data, charts, and all that. It's on the website. You can download it. What I want to do this morning is to give you drill down below that and give you some of the insights as to why and how things have taken place. Singapore is a very small country located in Southeast Asia. It was a British colony before and therefore has for more than 100 years been a strategic hub for trade and shipping. It is surrounded by larger and less developed neighbors in Southeast Asia. Small city-state, small island, no natural resources. The only resource that we have are people. In a sense, that focused the attention on the development of competitiveness very clearly. Unless our people learn and develop and contribute, we cannot survive. We cannot turn to anything other than the people that we have. And by the way, Singapore is an immigrant society. Most of the people living in Singapore today at one time came from China, India, and around the region. They go there to work as laborers. They go there to work as traders. So the quality of the manpower that formed the Singapore population is actually not very good. Because if they had been good and found jobs in their own country, they would not have traveled, left their family, traveled many miles to work as laborers just to survive. But yet, that's all we have. We may not, the quality of the labor pool may not be very high at the beginning, but that's all we have. And therefore, we have to educate and make sure that we maximize the potential of every individual worker and person we have in Singapore. If we don't do that, we stand no chance. And that explains the tremendous emphasis and focus on education, and also the focus on meritocracy so that each one is appointed and promoted based on his merits, his education, and his performance. Only then can we get the very best out of the very limited and traditionally not very high quality manpower pool. The macroeconomic fundamentals have been fairly strong. We have had for almost 50 years now a single political party who has been fairly reliable and trustworthy, very trusted. In fact, one of the recent surveys shows that Singaporeans trust their political leaders probably more than any other country because they have delivered. Our public services are efficient. We have strong institutions. I think the survey that Professor Cho earlier showed in terms of the quality of the politicians and bureaucrats, Singapore has been doing quite well. Currency has been stable, low inflation. We have strong fiscal position. We have significant reserves, a very low tax rate. The corporate tax rate, the top corporate tax rate is 17%. The personal top marginal income tax rate is 20%. But most professional, until you reach probably a very senior level, but most middle to upper level professionals will pay an income tax rate about 10 to 12% based on the income that they earn in a year. And we have a goods and services tax of 7%. Our official reserves are in excess of US $200 billion. The Singapore never reviews its total true reserves. These are and expectations. These are probably understated. What has made Singapore different has been the focus on the microeconomic parts of it, which is looking at the industry level, the cluster level, and the firm level type of competitiveness. As I mentioned earlier, Singapore is very connected to the global economy. We are completely open for trade and investment. That has been the legacy, our British legacy. The reason why Britain wanted Singapore was to use it as a hub for their trade. So that has been the legacy that Singapore has. We have constantly been rated having the best business environment in the world, in a dynamic environment that is constantly changing, world-class infrastructure, a good and improving education system, efficient public services, I mentioned that. A very focused cluster development effort. We don't just look at industry, we look at clusters which are related industries and work with the private sector to develop those clusters over the years. So today, Singapore has a very good semiconductor cluster, a very good oil refining cluster, life sciences cluster, and others. Perhaps Singapore is most well known as a major base for multinationals, both as a hub for high-value manufacturing as well as the regional operating headquarters. When Singapore opened its doors to foreign investments and multinationals in the mid-1960s, Singapore was among the few countries in the world that was welcoming. Most other countries were closing their doors, don't want to be colonized from an economic standpoint. But Singapore had to survive. So what today is common wisdom for most countries in terms of the development path, in the 1960s when Singapore adopted this policy, it was highly risky, it was highly counterintuitive, it was highly innovative. But what has become non-traditional is now the norm. Another thing that makes Singapore unique is we have a lot of state-owned enterprises, but the state-owned enterprises are very competitive. They are owned by the state or have significant ownership stake by the government, but yet they compete based on a level playing field according to market rules and have been able to expand beyond Singapore. That there's no protection for government-linked enterprises, and in fact, they have been doing quite well. We have a lot of small companies, and they mostly provide support-related services to the big multinationals and the government-linked enterprises. And as I will show you later on, as a response to the global economic crisis, as a re-emphasis on productivity and innovation for our competitiveness. Let me take you a step back. How did all this happen? It came from really a very clear focus on developing an economic strategy. And when we look at the development of the economic strategy in Singapore, context becomes very critical. As I mentioned, we were given self-government and were separated from Malaysia in 1965 with no one in their right mind and analysis given Singapore any chance to survive. Singapore itself did not believe it could survive. The reason why Singapore wanted to be merged with Malaysia is that the then Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, did not believe Singapore could survive on its own. As a small country with no resources, no hinterland, poor quality human resources, we did not believe and we did not think we could survive. So the context was important. When we were separated, it was literally a crisis, a survival crisis, and therefore a pragmatic approach to doing what was necessary, having a very clear assessment of what were the assets, which were a trading hub, a great port, a shipping hub of shipping routes, significant liabilities, untrained people, low quality human resources, low quality infrastructure, no skills for any hope of developing an economy, a viable economy. The capital we have was that the political leaders were trusted. There was significant cohesion among the people, and that was all that we had to build. The strategy then really relates to how we capitalize on what was available and do the best that we can. And because we were going into uncharted territory. Very few countries were open to multinationals. Very few countries invest so much in education. Very few countries offer low-cost housing. Very few countries at the time invest so much in education. We had to learn as we go. So it was a case of having a plan, taking some actions, being sensitive to feedback and market signals, adapting, continuously changing all the time. And that develops the Singapore culture. The Singapore culture comes from the experience of responding to crises and challenges. They were the assumptions that were deeply held, the values that were deeply held, that today form the beliefs and norms for our future. For example, today Singapore has a strong belief that it is highly vulnerable. There is a small state in a very volatile world. Our survival, even today, as a fairly developed country, cannot be taken for granted. We assume that nobody will help us if we don't help ourselves. We believe that we have to work hard. We believe that we have to be open to the rest of the world. We believe that unless we are of value to the rest of the world, we will not have a chance to make it. So those deep beliefs continue to influenced a lot of the thinking and policy development in Singapore. I can broadly characterize the pattern of economic development from 1965 to today under 3 broad periods. The first 15 years, as I briefly mentioned, was focused on survival. The focus was on jobs, housing, basic education, basic healthcare. People were living in slums. 4 or 5 families were living in a single house, each family in one small room. There was very little investment in the infrastructure. It was all run down and tattered and torn. So that was very fundamental. The strategy was based on building infrastructure, on trade, particularly for export, and then on attracting foreign direct investments, particularly in manufacturing, so that we could have jobs for the people. When the British left, for example, the British naval base, when it was closed, 20% of the workforce was left unemployed. What could we do with a British naval base where Singapore don't even have an armed forces? So the practical thing was to take the British infrastructure of the naval base and convert that to a shipyard. And today, Singapore companies are the largest rig builders in the world. Even though we have no oil, we have very little surrounding offshore facilities. The execution of those policies were largely given to what we call statutory boards. Statutory boards were focused government agencies, single mission, who will take the mission like the Economic Development Board, which is quite well known, and go into all over the world and to persuade multinationals to come and invest. That's their only job. Their success and failure depends on that. Or our Housing and Development Board, their only job is to build low-cost housing in order to provide decent housing for the population. Their basis of success is whether they achieve that. Or our port authority's job is to make sure that the Singapore port is the most competitive port in the world. Their success and failure depends on that. So we set up very focused statutory boards in order to execute the policies. Where the private sector have no capacity to operate, we set up government-linked companies in order to run those businesses. But right from the first day, they were not protected. They were not given preferential privileges. They had to compete on equal level playing field and fight. Singapore Airlines today is one of the best airlines in the world. If you talk to Singapore Airlines, they will tell you that they are discriminated against in Changi Airport in Singapore. They say that the authorities purposely make it difficult for Singapore Airlines so that they will not be accused of giving Singapore Airlines preferential treatment. That's the attitude. And because they had to fight, even though for the gates in Singapore, they can compete with anyone in the world. The drivers of success were leaders, the drive, the values, and belief. We achieved a very high level of economic development by the late 1970s, and we have shortage of labor. Therefore, the transition was to move towards higher value-added activities through restructuring, through diversification, and the focus on services. So we increased our wages, we changed the education, we increased the investment in worker training. In the 1990s and to today, the focus has shifted again on talent, on innovation, and ensuring that the society stays together. Because we are globally connected, the globally mobile talent earn wages at global scale. The workers who are not globally mobile or don't have the education and the skill earn local wages, which are almost third world. So the social divide and the disparity continues to worsen. So there's a great concern that as we continue to develop our society, the cohesion and the concern of people are taken care of, particularly things like population. Singapore is losing, the population is getting smaller, the local population is getting smaller because people are not having enough children and they're not getting married, early enough. We have an aging population. In 30 years, Singapore will be the oldest country in the world with the highest aged workforce population in the world, healthcare. The strategy becomes creating a global city where the best people in the world would want to live, work, and raise a family. We believe that if we can make it attractive for some of the best people in the world to want to make Singapore their home, then that's how we will survive for the future. The future is no longer going to be based on just companies and infrastructure and manufacturing, but based on talent and the kind of ideas and innovation that they create. The execution, as I mentioned, has been largely based on building a broad consensus for a major economic policy. And I will talk about one of those that we did last year. The appointment of able and trusted leaders to implement major policies and rewarding them. Some of you know that Singapore public servants, public leaders, are the most highly paid in the world. The Singapore Prime Minister is the most highly paid Prime Minister in the world, but he's not the most richest in the world. His wages are clean, his wages are clear, it's public, it's transparent. We benchmark our public sector leaders against the private sector so that they do not lose out and can give their whole heart and mind to implementing policy and creating policy that benefits the whole country. We have very focused statutory board, as I mentioned earlier. We build the economic infrastructure to allow foreign direct investment to flourish in Singapore. Investors are treated as partners. So when a foreign direct investor comes in, they are not then abandoned. The Economic Development Board continue to work with foreign direct investors and help them. And most of our new investments are from companies who are already invested in Singapore. So they are repeat investments. Most of the big high value investments are from repeat investments. People who have come to be, companies that have come to be familiar with Singapore and want to do business in Singapore, despite the fact that our wages are now relatively high. Like I say, US government-linked companies to spearhead and start activities if the private sector did not want to enter, but subject these government-linked companies to the same market discipline as the private sector. That is one of the unique characteristics of Singapore. People do not understand how is it you can have state-owned enterprises, but they don't suffer the same disease as state-owned enterprises. They are competitive private companies. We deepen economic clusters by extending and building linkages. We build a world-class oil chemical cluster by leveraging on the initial investment that Shell and Exxon and Mobil and BP and others have made. And their early investments in oil refining in Singapore was made because they wanted to have to build capital-intensive facility in an environment where their investments were safe. But once you build that, then it is encouraging them to continue to build the facilities to process their feedstocks and to process so that they get higher value products from downstream. That leads to a petrochemical industry. From the petrochemical industry, then we extend that to a chemical industry. Every time it was working together with the investors to make the investment so that today we have a world-class petrochemical and chemical industry, although most of the products are made for exports. I wrote a book on dynamic governance. You can find that on our website as well. I can summarize the model or the path of Singapore's economic development under culture, capabilities, and change. There are a lot of the policies and economic development and fundamentals was based on very strong beliefs about how small we are, how vulnerable we are, the need to be self-reliable, and also the focus on economic growth, focusing on certain key principles. Then building the capabilities in our people and in our institutions to be able to conceive of strategy and to be able to implement the strategy. And recognizing that we have no choice but to continue to live in a world of change. That in a small country, in a very volatile world, we cannot dictate the pace of change. We can only make sure that we adapt to the change. And therefore, we take it as a given that we will have to throw away things that may be fairly recent in terms of policy investments because otherwise we will not survive. As an example, last year, in the midst of the crisis, we formed an Economic Strategies Committee to review our fundamental strategies It's chaired by the finance ministers, had public sector leaders and private sector leaders in subcommittees that reviewed several areas, and they came up and released a report earlier this year. And to show the seriousness of the report, this year's government budget was focused on implementing the recommendations of the committee. And the focus of the strategy, and this is my last slide, was really recognizing that the fundamentals that will keep Singapore competitive and sustain it going forward are highly skilled people, being an innovative economy, and developing a distinctive global city that the best people in the world want to make it their home. So global city, enduring home for people, growing through skills and innovation, being a hub for companies who want to be in Asia. Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, China are excellently located in East Asia, but when you want to tackle the Indian market, you are a bit inconvenient. Singapore becomes very convenient for companies that want to have a base to both penetrate into China as well as India and Southeast Asia. Diverse corporate ecosystem so that multiple types of enterprises can grow, focus on innovation and investment in R&D and talent. We are transforming the whole economy so that we use smart energy and less of the traditional carbon footprint that we have. And we are so small, and we need to make sure that we use land more productively and enhance the land usage. That is really encapsulate the thinking in terms of what we believe will make Singapore continue to be productive and competitive going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siong. Then we have the last speaker, Dr. Raine Hermans. He's give us a presentation on the national competitiveness, the case of Finland. I'll just briefly introduce Dr. Raine Hermans.